from the High V Studios. News Radio 1040 WHO. Views expressed are those of hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of News Radio 1040 WHO.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jan Mickelson. What we're going to do here today, we're going to have lots and lots of open night time. You might have seen the video of that horrific shooting down there in South Carolina, where if we think what happened, what we saw what happened, a cop was way too aggressive and shot a fleeing traffic stop in the back several times. The cop is in jail. We'll talk about that later with a fellow who says Iowa has we're similarly afflicted. It might not be as violent, but racial hostility and animus is here as well. We'll talk about that. You know that you're a front runner in a presidential race when your own party starts to buy attack ads.
The Senate is considering tough new sanctions on Iran. President Obama says he'll veto them, and Rand Paul is standing with him. Rand Paul supports Obama's negotiations with Iran, and he doesn't understand the threat.
You know, it's ridiculous to think that they're a threat to our national security.
Rand Paul is wrong and dangerous. Tell him to stop siding with Obama, because even one Iranian bomb would be a disaster.
Well, according to the Quinnipiac poll, Rand Paul is running number one in the presidential race here in Iowa. Not only that, if the election were today and Hillary Clinton were the Democrat Party's candidate, Rand Paul would beat her. So back to the point, Senator Paul, you know you're a front runner when your own party starts to attack you. Who put those commercials together? Because you can't find, I went up on their website, and you can't find anybody willing to take responsibility for them.
You know, when you put a pack of lies forward, who wants to take responsibility for it? But you know what they do say? They say you're over the target when you're drawing flack. And so, a bunch of innuendo and falsehoods, put a fact that it was mostly false. I think really some people just don't want to have an honest discussion about this. I've been talking about this for months now. I think that, I've been very explicit that any kind of deal with Iran would have to be voted on by Congress. I'm a co-sponsor of the Corker legislation that says so. I've been open and forthright about saying that I'm concerned about the Iranians putting forth a message that says what Obama says about the agreement is completely the opposite of what they believe the agreement to be. So there's a lot of skepticism on my part and a lot of belief that the Iranians may not be credible partners at this point, since they put out things in English immediately denying everything we say is in the agreement. So really, I think they've mischaracterized my position on Iran. But one thing I do say that is different than Republicans is that I do prefer negotiations to war. And I think you don't want someone leading the country who is anxious for war or reckless for war with Iran. We've had war over there for 15, 20 years now, and the last thing we need is another war. None of that means that I want to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I will do everything we can to stop them.
I was actually polled this morning by one of these national polling services, and they asked me if I thought that the United States, at least initially, got a good result from that negotiation with Iran. And I'm not an expert on this, but I'd have to say no on the basis of some reporting. I had to say no. What would you have said and why?
I would say that I'm skeptical, and I would also say that nobody knows what the agreement is. And this is what's crazy about it. What we've gotten is a 1,300-word statement from President Obama's administration and a 500-word statement from the Iranians. And what troubles me most is they don't agree as to what they think the agreement actually says. So we haven't seen the agreement. That's when people say, are you for or against the agreement? I say, well, I'd at least like to read the agreement. I like to read bills before I make a decision. But I am somewhat skeptical because I'm concerned that the Iranians don't appear to be trustworthy with even adhering at the very outset to what the meaning of the agreement is. And so that does concern me. But what I don't want to be is someone who sticks their head in the sand and says, oh, I'm absolutely opposed to any negotiations. Ronald Reagan is considered by many Republicans to be the greatest president in our recent history from a Republican point of view. He talked with the Russians. And many of the crazy neocons in our party, they blasted Reagan at the time. They said Reagan was terrible and a traitor and weak for talking to the Russians. Well, in the end, we, I think, did the right thing. And negotiations are, for the most part, better than war. There's a time for war, but war should be the last resort and not the first resort.
All right. You used a label a second ago, neocons, and that is a label sometimes people, during the early parts of the war, people would label me as a neocon, and I didn't know what it meant. And I looked it up, and I think it means somebody who was a conservative, or I'm sorry, somebody who was a liberal a few years ago before the war started, and then they became a hawk on the war, and now we call them neocons. They are still liberals when it comes to social, political issues, but they're hawkish on the war. And,
I don't think I'd put you in that category.
I'm not in that category.
For a while.
Well, so there's a new terminology called conservatarian. Are you happy with that, or a libertarian, or just generic?
Labels are kind of funny, and all of them are partly accurate. The one I probably choose the most, and the one we used to describe ourselves when I ran for office, was constitutional conservative. And I am a stickler for paying attention to the letter of the law. I'm a believer that the rule of law prevents arbitrary power, prevents the abuse of power, and that our founding fathers were amazing in coming forward with basically a document that restrains governmental power. So I think a constitutional conservative is probably the best description I'd like to take.
All right. I actually gave my computer screen a standing ovation yesterday. In this because I don't know where you were, but somebody tried to serve you up a gotcha question, and you slammed it back over the net, and here's what it sounded like.
Why don't we ask the DNC, is it okay to kill a 7-pound baby in the uterus? You go back and you ask Debbie Wasserman Schultz if she's okay with killing a 7-pound baby that is just not yet born yet. Ask her when life begins, and you ask Debbie when she's willing to protect life. When you get an answer from Debbie, come back to me.
Thank you.
That's excellent. And by the way, feel free at any time to shush her. Just.
No, I've discontinued that. I no longer am using it.
Well, that was an important moment because here's what I think it is anyway, because most of the time when people take a pro-life position, it is thought that must, by definition, be a defensive position, and I don't think so. And the way you handled it sounds like it's not. You're not willing to be put on the defensive on the life issue either.
Well, the thing is, I'm a physician, and when I think of little babies, I think of the babies I examine in the neonatal nursery. I examine their eyes. Some of these babies are a pound. And I just can't imagine how people think that a 7-pound baby, 8-pound baby that's getting ready to be born basically has no rights. And I was actually sort of aghast that the DNC came back and said, this is a decision, period, with the patient and the doctor for a 7-pound baby, whether or not you can abort a 7-pound baby. And it's sort of remarkably out of step because, I have friends who are pro-choice, who aren't pro-life. And when I talk to them, almost none of them believe that you should abort a 7, 8, 9-pound full-term baby. So the fact that she believes that, really, we talk about extremists. This is a position that's so far outside the norm that most pro-choice people are not in favor of, abortions in the third trimester.
If you do get the Fed audited, and if you do find some mischief has been done or something grossly irresponsible, what are you prepared to do about it?
Well, I think it's imperative that we do it. I'll give you one example of why we should do it. Richard Cordray is head of this big regulatory body that's run by the Fed called the Consumer Financial Protection Board. They did $200 million worth of renovation that's on their building. And when a congressman asked him about it in a hearing, he just told the congressman to take a flying leap that it was none of his business. And that kind of arrogance comes because they're not audited. They say, oh, well, we condescend and we come and we talk to you once a year in your committee. Well, talking to us is not oversight. Oversight is when the purse strings, when the salaries, all of that, when that would be controlled by Congress, people say, oh, well, that's terrible. We'd have Congress involved with the monetary supply. Well, it's like we created the Fed. You know, the Constitution gave the power to regulate the money supply to Congress. It didn't give it to the Fed. And there's some dispute on whether or not you can even give up legislative authority, you know, whether or not things that were delegated to the legislature can actually be given to another body. But at the very least, they ought to be audited. And the fact that they are so vociferous in opposing an audit makes you kind of wonder, do they have something to hide?
Would you put them in the category of too big to fail?
Well, we have several organizations like that. Pentagon says they're too big to be audited. The Fed is too arrogant to be audited, and the Fed uses all their resources. I mean, they took the resources, all of the power they have from having the monopoly to manipulate the money supply. They used all that governmental power to oppose legislation. And I really think if they're an independent organization, they shouldn't be meddling with legislature. I mean, the legislation, they shouldn't be really coming to Washington, going all throughout the media, lobbying against something that's a transparency measure.
Last question. What is your position on RFRA?
I can't imagine that anybody could be opposed to religious liberty or that anybody would be forced to do something or to participate in a religious ceremony that they don't agree with. And I've told people that the amazing thing is that we had some of this debate when the founding went on. People talked about, would there be a necessity for a Bill of Rights? And many of the people who were opposed to the Bill of Rights said, well, surely no one would ever challenge the free exercise of religion or, you know, the independence of religious thought, free association, all of those things. And it was a big debate. And some said, if you list this, people think that's all the rights we have and that there aren't more rights that should be protected. But it amazes me and is probably an interesting debate because in the end, we did need the Bill of Rights because even now with the Bill of Rights, there are still people questioning whether or not you should have religious liberty. But I come down on the side of absolutely being in favor of religious liberty.
You're going to be at a rally at the University of Iowa, it looks like. When and where?
That'll be tomorrow, I believe.
It's at 10 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah, we won't get any college kids if it's 6 in the morning. I think it's probably around about 10 in the morning.
Yeah, that's what I said, 10 in the morning.
Oh, okay. I
That's
must
okay.
be hearing you through my bad ear.
That's all right. So 10 o'clock at the University of Iowa, do you have a place or who is that for? And the other part of this is your dad, and you're probably irritated at the constant comparison, but your dad made college campuses his personal turf during the presidential race. Do you think you will inherit that same affection from college-age kids?
We plan on mobilizing youth throughout the country. It's a big part of our strategy to go to college campuses because we think that college kids innately get the idea of privacy, the idea that government shouldn't be looking at your phone records. And so I think there's a lot of hope for students to come to our side. And so we're going to really try hard in Iowa to get organized on all the university campuses.
Senator Rand Paul, thank you for joining us briefly this morning, a couple of days after your official announcement. And by the way, stay away from the Today Show, please. That's just
all right, Jan. Thanks
a lot, sir. Appreciate it.
Bye.